Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to review a special lens, and that is the new Sigma 135mm F1.4 DG art lens. Now, a lot of you have been clamoring for two lenses, one of those being the new mirrorless version of the 135mm F1.8 from Sigma, and others that really loved the 105mm F1.4, which was what they called kind of their bokeh monster back in the DSLR era. Neither one of those lenses have had a direct replacement, and that continues to be true, though in many ways the lens I'm reviewing today is kind of the spiritual successor of both. We have both a new 135mm lens designed specifically for mirrorless, Sony E-mount, and then also L-mount. But we also have a portrait lens that is longer than 85mm that has a maximum aperture of f1.4. So here in the form of the 135mm f1.4, this is a world's first to combine that focal length with this maximum aperture. And it means that, as you can see right now, I'm shooting at f1.4 on the lens, that you're able to get more subject isolation and separation from the background than ever before, because this has the equivalent of the pupil entrance diameter, the effective diameter, has the equivalent of a 200mm f2 lens, making this truly special if your priority is subject isolation. Now, obviously, that's going to come at a cost, as is always the case. This is a lens that is bigger and heavier and has kind of a different form factor than any of the 135mm lenses that you might have been familiar with in the past. Fortunately, the price, however, is pretty moderate. $1,549 US, though while that positions it between the Sony GM lens at $2,200, you've also got on the other end, with a lot of pressure, the Viltrox Lab 135mm f1.8, another exceptional lens in its own right. And so this really boils down to whether or not that extreme jump from f1.8 to f1.4 is enough to be a difference maker for you. And we'll try to explore whether or not that is actually the case in today's review. So we're going to dive in and take a look right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by the all-new Fantom Tracker 2.0. Fantom has not only seriously upgraded the visual look of the card, but now we have a superior build quality made with tempered glass and metal alloys. This credit card size tracker can be locally tracked via a 90 decibel beeping noise, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My Network and its map. The addition of NFC means that you can also use the card to trigger an automation. Just tap it. The tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and assures you won't lose your valuables. It has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge can last up to 6 months. The Fantom Tracker 2.0 makes for a seriously cool gift, so visit store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 at checkout for 20% off. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 for 20% off.
Now, in full disclosure, this lens was sent to me by Sigma for evaluation. It is a loaner that will be going back to Sigma at the end of this video, and they have had no input in the review, and they will not see it before you do. As always, this is a completely independent review, and my findings are my own. Now, while I filmed all of the outdoor segments with the 135mm f1.4, because I'm going to demonstrate it and talk about it in here, I am filming this on the new 35mm f1.2 Mark II from Sigma. Now, obviously, there is a significant difference when you go from f1.8, as has been the most recent conventional. It used to be f2, moved to f1.8, and now Sigma's going to try to make the new standard f1.4. That really makes a significant difference because the effective diameter goes from about 75mm at f1.8 to a whopping 96mm at f1.4. As I mentioned in the intro, that's the same as a 200mm f2. So that is a lot of subject separation and isolation, but it also means, obviously, when you press the boundaries on the maximum aperture at a particular focal length, that comes with the downside of making a lens that is going to be bigger and heavier. Now, ironically, if I put the Viltrox and the Sigma side by side and stand them upright and turn the tripod collar away, you would be tempted to think that one is not particularly bigger than the other, because the Viltrox is actually a little bit longer. It's 145.7 millimeters versus 137.5 millimeters or 5.4 inches in length for the Sigma lens. But if you turn them the other direction with the front glass facing forward, that's where you get a radical difference. The diameter is 111.7 millimeters or 4.4 inches for the Sigma versus 93 millimeters for the Viltrox lens. It also means that while most 135 millimeter lenses have an 82 millimeter front filter thread, we jump up to 105 millimeters here on the Sigma. Now, that's a little bit more of a challenge here because very likely you don't have a complete filter set at 105 millimeters, which is exceptionally large. And that means, in this case, unlike, let's say a lot of the lenses that have had 105 millimeters, be like 150 to 600 millimeter type lens, you may not need filters for a lens like that. It's got a relatively slow maximum aperture. In this case, with an f1.4 aperture, you're very likely going to want to use at least an ND filter to try to do flash sync speeds. If you do strobing at all, well, that means probably buying some new filters. And so another thing to factor in there comparatively, and unfortunately, it's not going to be filters that you get to share across a lot of other lenses because this is a relatively uncommon filter size. It also comes with some additional weight. This lens weighs in at 1,420 grams. That's 50.4 ounces. So that makes it about 500 grams heavier than the Sony 135mm f1.8 GM, for example. And so it is a significantly heavy lens. And unlike any of the other 135mm lenses, it necessitates, in Sigma's mind, coming with a tripod collar here. Now, unlike some of their other recent lenses, this tripod collar is actually removable. It's quite simple to remove, and so you can take that off if you don't want to use it. However, when it comes to balance, you may find that it's easier to use it with a tripod collar and foot on the tripod itself. The profile of this lens is really different from most of the 135mm lenses. It looks less kind of long and slender, but instead more squat. And that it looks really probably most like the 105mm f1.4 from the DSLR era. Now we have as is now common for Sigma, we have a thorough feature set here. And so that includes thorough control of aperture, the ability to have clicks at 1/3 stop to tenths. There is a switch here on the left side of the lens barrel low down, which will allow you to go to a declicked position. And I was able to get smooth and effective aperture racks when I was in the declicked position. On the right side of the barrel, there is an iris lock. And so you can either lock yourself into or out of the manual aperture ring, depending on your taste, whether or not you want to always prefer control from within camera or prefer with the aperture ring. You can use that lock to keep you in or out of that. Also, in terms of other controls, we have an AF/MF switch here on the side, and we have dual function buttons, custom buttons, and the value of those buttons are assigned from within the camera. They both will share the same function. They're just designed so you can have one readily available, whether you're shooting in landscape or in portrait orientation. And so the one thing that is missing here, interestingly, is the fact that there is no focus limiter. It shows maybe some confidence in the autofocus speeds of that. However, most of the competing lenses do have a focus limiter. So I was kind of interested to see that omitted. The aperture iris itself is a higher than typical 13 blades. It helps to keep the aperture shape very circular as you stop down. We'll go through that aperture rack once again. You can see that it keeps a nicely circular shape as you go by from that. And so it does an effective job on that, which is great. The manual focus ring, it's not small, but it comes across as being relatively small compared to some other 135mm lenses. And that is because this particular lens has to flare out so much to that huge front entrance pupil there element. And so that means that it limits the space that this can occupy. It does have a nice degree of damping. It moves very smoothly. I think that the manual focus is excellent on here. No concerns about that. There is no optical stabilizer in this lens, but there isn't in any of the competition either. So I'm not going to make any kind of stink over that. We do have Sigma's dust and moisture resistance built into the lens, so that's a gasket at the lens mount, seals throughout, and then a coating on the front element to prevent fingerprints and dust, make it easier to clean, and so all of that is good. The lens hood is massive. I mean, you can drop it right over the outside of most other lenses because it is so big, and so it has that huge diameter to it. It does have rubberized front element. It's kind of the shape that typically you would expect it to have, the tension knob here on the bottom. This is a bayonet style lens hood, however, and it does click into place with a lock here on the side. has unfortunately been the case with all of the 135mm lenses on Sony E-mount that I've tested, there is no room for teleconverters here. That's true on Sony, but also I think it's going to be the case on L-mount as well. I see no mention in any of Sigma's literature of any kind of teleconverter compatibility. That is unfortunate. Minimum focus distance is not fully competitive with some of the other lenses. And so if I look across the Sony GM, the Viltrox, and the Samyang 135 f1.8 lenses, I find that all of them can focus in and around 70 centimeters and have a maximum magnification of about 0.25 times. In this case, the minimum focus distance is considerably higher. It is only 1.1 meters or 110 centimeters versus that 70. Or that's 3.61 feet, and the maximum magnification as a result is much lower. It's only 0.144 times. So here's how that compares compared to the Viltrox. So not nearly the same degree of magnification. As mentioned, the price is $1,549 US, and so that fits in between the Sony GM at $2,200 and then the Lab Series lens at $900. And so obviously it hits the middle ground, which is kind of the sweet spot for Sigma lenses, though I think in this case, having such an excellent lens available for $900 is going to put some pressure. You have to really want that f1.4 aperture, but there will be some of you that do, obviously. So at the end of the day, it's pretty much what we would expect from a modern Sigma lens. It's nicely built, feature-rich, handles well. It's also big and heavy in this instance. So let's talk autofocus. This is the first of Sigma's lenses to receive dual HLA focus motors. That stands for high-speed linear actuator, and that is Sigma's latest and best autofocus system. The fact that they have employed two here, and they didn't, to my knowledge, in the 300 to 600mm f4 or in the 200mm f2 is actually pretty interesting. But obviously with such big glass elements, there was a need for a little bit of additional thrust with this lens. And what I found is that autofocus speed is very, very good. In my formal test, you can see that I go from a close to a distant subject pretty close to instantly. There's very, very little lag, and if you go back to the previous generation, a lens with such a large maximum aperture to be focusing this quick is really, really impressive. What I also found is that even at f1.4, I had no problem in tracking birds in flight. That tends to be a little bit less complicated, particularly when they're moving in a lateral kind of way, but shooting at f1.4 and nailing basically every shot is very impressive. I had a little bit less impressive results when I had Ferrari run towards me, Ferrari being one of my cats, and you can see that it really is kind of hit and miss. And what I found is that sometimes there would be a swing where focus would be dropping back to back focus, try to move forward, and just kind of overcompensate a little bit there. And so in that kind of situation, I wouldn't call this a sports lens, particularly if it's kind of, moving linearly towards you. That tends to be a little bit more of a problem. But for all the other types of shooting that I did, I had no problem. So let's take a look at the lens in its primary application, and that is for portrait work. So unfortunately, the tight turnaround with my time with the lens and also my very tight review schedule at the moment means that I wasn't able, despite my best efforts, to get an actual portrait session. So unfortunately, you and I are stuck together. And that's unfortunate for a couple of reasons. Number one, you have to look at me even more. But number two, it means that I have to work from in front of the camera remotely as opposed to being behind the camera when it comes to the actual focus for portrait work. Now, the good news is that these days it's pretty foolproof when it comes to shooting portraits on modern cameras. The eye tracking is so good, and on top of that, of course, focus systems have gotten better, both in the cameras and then also in the lenses themselves. And so from what I saw shooting in other scenarios, I have great confidence that this is going to perform very, very well when it comes to portrait work. And you'll be able to see the results here in the review as well. But I did want to give you this disclaimer that I had to shoot remotely for the portrait type shots. There was not a human operator behind the camera, just one in front of the camera. And unfortunately, that same bozo was also the model. Now, that caveat aside, you can see by looking at the various shots that this is a lens that has no problem focusing under that situation and, probably more importantly, producing really beautiful results with great subject isolation and a beautifully blurred out soft background. And I think that that is kind of the main thing that people are looking for this lens. It's got plenty of thrust to keep up with portrait type subjects, wedding subjects, things like that. And it's going to deliver accurately focused results. That's what we're all looking for here. So when it comes to shooting video, we'll test the AF performance in a variety of ways, but I wanted to start by just doing a little bit of approaching the camera, and then we'll do our test where I'll back up a little bit here for the sake of framing. I'm going to step out of the frame and back into the frame. See how it picked me back up, out, in. Now let's go a little bit more fast. And back in. Hopefully it's done fine in these tests. Now, as far as other aspects for video, you can see here in my focus pulls that there's relatively good confidence going back and forth, maybe a little bit of a micro pulse as it settles there at the end. You will notice that when you're making major focus changes, as we just saw in the stepping in and out of frame, and then also in this test, that if it's a major focus change, focus breathing is fairly obvious. In smaller focus changes, it's going to be far less obvious, so your mileage may vary depending on what kind of footage that you are shooting. My hand test went reasonably well with good transitions from my hand to my face and vice versa, so no major problem with that. And as we've seen from these outdoor settings, shooting like this, there's no problem with stability if I'm walking towards the camera, if I'm moving around. It's staying locked on even at f1.4. So at the end of the day, I would say that autofocus is doing a good job for video work. So how about the image quality? We've got an optical design of 17 elements in 13 groups. That includes 4 FLD elements, 2 spherical lenses as a part of the design. The MTF chart shows that actually the mid-frame is a bit sharper than what the center is. There's a little bit of a rise in the middle and then a little bit more of a fade towards the corners, though not to any kind of significant degree. Sigma benchmark the Sony GM lens here, showing that there's a little bit of give and take between the two lenses, but the Sigma is very competitive at f1.4 with the GM lens at f1.8, both of them being at their maximum apertures. Now, the Viltrox lens is really the sharpest lens, 135mm lens available on this Sony platform that I'm testing on. And what I found is that head-to-head, it's not by any significant margin, but the Viltrox is still a little bit sharper with than the Sigma lens, even if I stop the Sigma down to f1.8 as well. And so if you're looking for kind of like to have the absolute highest performance, it's not that, but the fact that it's competitive while going, 2/3 of a stop wider is impressive, obviously. And so that makes it significantly different compared to any lens that's come before. Now, when I move on to other metrics, as is kind of the case with, say, their 85mm f1.4, there's a little bit more pin cushion distortion than what the competing lenses have. Most 135mm lenses are pretty neutral when it comes to distortion. This has some pretty obvious pin cushion distortion. It's not terrible and it's linear, so I could correct it with a -6. No major issue there. The vignette, however, is very low. At +27, it is better than the competing lenses, and that's where the payoff for that massive front entrance pupil is paying off there. I also found that there are very low amounts of fringing. Any of the tested situations, be it longitudinal style, before and after the plane of focus, that's very relevant here because there's going to be a lot of things that are out of the plane of focus here. And then less maybe relevant is lateral style chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame. Those are well controlled as well, so no problem with that. When I did my test charts on a 61 megapixel Sony a7R Mark V, and I'm going to show the crops at 200% magnification in this overview here, you'll find that sharpness is really good and very consistent all across the frame. It's good in the center, even better, as the MTF suggests, in the mid frame, and the corners are really not far behind. They are very, very good. I also found that this lens had good centering, the copy that I tested, with the 4 corners delivering similar results. Stopping down a little bit, I would say that by f2.8, the corners are pin sharp and sharpness is basically perfect all across the frame. I did feel that just kind of instinctually, and so I went to test for it, that there isn't quite as much bite to images as what the Viltrox produces, and that proved to be the case in this comparison. For example, if I look in close to those textures, there's just a little bit more micro contrast, a little bit more information and contrast in the textures on this than what there is, but it's exceptionally good already, and frankly, without the two lenses side by side, you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference. Obviously, as you stop down with this lens, it's not because you need additional sharpness, it's to produce increasingly deep depth of field. And you will need that because at 135 millimeter, it's pretty surprising how shallow depth of field it still is at, say, f4, for example. And so there will be situations where you can stop it down, though obviously you buy this lens to shoot it probably often at f1.4. When I got to testing diffraction at the other end of the spectrum, it does soften a little bit by f11 and a bit more by the minimum aperture of f16. It's not bad, however, and in a critical situation, you probably could get by with shooting at that. Obviously, you're going to have an extremely shallow depth of field. And so here, I just wanted to give you a look at, and it's not a very enticing pose here, but just wanted to give you a look at the difference between f1.4, then f1.8, then f2, then f2.8 at a distance from the camera of about, let's say, about 3 meters away. And so in that situation, 10 feet roughly, even at that distance, you're going to find that it's only a little is in focus at a time. And so you may need to stop down the lens if you're shooting at closer distances just to increase depth of field enough to say that to where both eyes are in focus, for example, because they won't be at f1.4, that's for certain. What I also found is that not only is the bokeh quality good, and of course at closer distances you just obliterate backgrounds. They just turn into this soft amount of cream. But at more medium distances, I think and that's really where I think 135 millimeter lenses are special. At that medium distance, anywhere between, say, 20 and 40 feet, and you go throughout that range, and you're going to find that there's this beautiful three-dimensional cutout effect where you just have this, the subject just kind of pops from the background. And that really is what makes 135 millimeter lenses generally special, and in this case, really uniquely special because of that f1.4 aperture. Now, surprisingly, for having such a huge front element, I actually found that the lens showed pretty good flare resistance, which hasn't always been the case for lenses with big apertures like this in the past. And so as I shot in various situations, I found that flare resistance was really quite good, so no complaints there. I just so happened to be shooting Astro, testing a different lens one night, and it's like, well, why not throw it on there and take a look? And I know that there might be a few of you, it's niche, but there are a few of you that might be interested in a lens like this for deep field Astro. And I would say that this is a great option for that. It's not only got that f1.4 aperture and low vignette in the corners, it's also got very low instance of coma. And so it's actually, that's a niche application, but I do think that it is an interesting application for this lens because it's just another area where it performs very well. So my overall overview of the optics here is that Sigma's done a bang-on job of, increasing what's possible at this focal length while still delivering very, very high performance in basically every metric. And so great job on that front, Sigma. So what's my conclusion? The biggest challenge I would say for the Sigma 135mm f1.4 is the fact that 135mm lenses are beautifully dramatic. And as you've been able to see from the footage in this video, they can produce really, really gorgeous images and video footage. The challenge, however, is that 135 millimeters is not a particular flexible focal length. It's probably too long for most people to use in any kind of studio setting. In many indoor settings, it's a little bit too long. And so that means that this is a lens, like other 135 millimeter lenses, really for people who are going to shoot out in big spaces like this, that will go out and do environmental portraiture, maybe like 135 millimeter for shooting in certain kind of indoor spaces to give that unique cutout look. And it does provide a really unique look. And of course, with an f1.4 aperture, it's able to do a little bit more of that than any 135 millimeter lens before. But it's still going to be a niche lens for only a certain amount of people. And in this case, that means not only accepting the limitations of the 135 millimeter focal length, but also accepting the limitations of a lens that is bigger and heavier than any of the competitors. At the end of the day, I think that there is a market for this lens. The same kind of people that love the 105mm f1.4 may love this lens also. But of course, 135mm is not 105mm. That extra 30mm means that it's just a slightly less flexible instrument, and that is going to come with a bit of downsides. In some ways, I think Sigma might have been better off at doing a new 105mm f1.4, but then again, Sigma loves to be the world's first at things, and they've done it once again. And not only have they done it, they've done it successfully. This is a lens that autofocuses well. It is a lens that produces beautiful image quality. It has very few optical limitations at 135mm f1.4, despite the fact that no one has ever done it before. And so kudos to Sigma on that front. And I just hope that there are enough of you out there for whom this is your dream lens, and that is going to make it worthwhile for Sigma. Now, if you want more information, you can check out my full text review that is linked in the description down below on the newly redesigned DustinAbbott.net. Check it out, you'll enjoy it there. Also, there are buying links at $1,549 US. This isn't cheap, but for what you are getting, it's a pretty exceptional lens that is going to undercut the first-party competition by close to $700. And so that is a meaningful difference. Now, if you want the deep dive into the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now, and we're going to jump into that together. I will also follow this up a few weeks down the road with a direct head-to-head with the Viltrox Lab 135mm f1.8, so stay tuned for that. Let's jump into the optical deep dive.
Okay, let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You can see that there is some obvious pincushion distortion here, that squeeze in the middle. In some cases, it's not a bad thing. Some pincushion distortion could be a bit flattering for models because it makes them a little bit slimmer. This is maybe a little bit more than what you would like. It takes a -6 to correct it, but you can see it does correct in a nice linear fashion. Vignette is very low, so I only needed about a stop around +27 to correct for that in the corners, so no big deal there at all. And when it comes to fringing, there is a tiny bit of fringing before the plane of focus, not really much after the plane of focus, no big deal there. Likewise, lateral style chromatic aberrations in the corner, everything is near perfect here. When it comes to sharpness and contrast, here's the test chart that we're going to use, and we're going to take a look at 200% levels of magnification, and this is on a 61 megapixel Sony sensor. You can see in the middle of the frame, nice and sharp, good contrast, no problems there. Mid-frame looks even better. We can see this moire pattern. It's because there's even better contrast here. Both of the planes are lining up really nicely. We go down here, we can see that the upper left corner and the lower right corner look almost identical on this, which is fantastic. And as we pan towards the extreme corner, we can see the detail really is holding up right out until the very edge. And so this is a really consistently good performance. And this is not just a paper tiger either. I can go out into real world and I can get nice crisp looking results at f1.4. And obviously, even though I'm just isolating this in the midst of a lot of other of these heads of dried grass coming up, you can see just how much subject isolation you're able to get very quickly to turning this into a piece of art from a very simple subject. Likewise here on the wing, shooting at f1.4, we can see, good, not only good focus, but also good detail there. And with a slower moving seagull here, you can see just how great the detail is. And all of this is at f1.4. In that transition zone towards defocus, there's a tiny little bit of jitteriness there, but you can see very quickly it just becomes this really creamy, completely defocused background. Now, if we close the aperture down to f1.8, it allows us to do one head-to-head here with the Viltrox. I'm going to save most of these actual head-to-heads for the sake of the length of this video, but also I'm going to do a second complete head-to-head versus video episode, and we'll reserve most of the comparison shots for that. So here in the center of the frame, you can see both of them at f1.8. The results are largely similar with maybe just a little bit of additional contrast for the Viltrox lens. In the mid-frame, you can see that both of them are extremely good. I would have a hard time calling a winner from one of these. Down in the corner, I would say that they, again, remain very close, though maybe the Sigma remains crisper right out to the very corner, just a little bit better. Up in this corner, we can see, similarly, I would say that the Sigma has a tiny edge in the corners, so a little bit of an edge for Viltrox maybe in the center of the frame, and then for Sigma in the corners. But, as we can see, both of them are delivering really excellent performance, very sharp. This zone, Viltrox is a little bit better, so it's give and take across the frame. From f2 to f2.8, you can see that contrast increases even more at f2.8, and now it's just exceptionally sharp in the center of the frame. It was already exceptionally sharp in the mid frame, and it's even better now. And we can see down into the corners. The corners look super crisp now. I mean, that's the level of corner performance that I rarely see. So fantastic results there, and as I've noted previously, centering is good with consistent results across the frame. Beyond that, you're not going to see a lot of additional sharpness. You're going to treat it more for depth of field. By f11, diffraction will start to soften the image a bit, and you can see a bit more by the minimum aperture of f16, though it's still not terrible, but it's nowhere near the kind of levels we saw at the wider apertures. Now, we've seen already that the Sigma doesn't have quite the level of magnification that some of the competing lenses do, but fortunately it is quite good up close, even at f1.4. Contrast isn't off the charts here, but detail is really quite good, and we can see that the plane of focus is fairly flat, delivering a consistent result out towards the edges of the frame. Now we can see a couple of things from this next series of shots. This is at f1.4, and so at f1.4 you can see the bokeh circles are huge, massive, big and round, and we can see here that there's minimal amounts of fringing, almost nothing in the transition from focus to defocus there. We can see also, if we look at the specular highlights, not too bad in terms of outlining there, pretty clean overall. And then as we stop down at f2, the geometry is looking really good, except for the extreme corner, and then by f2.8, even in the corners were resolved to a very circular shape. And so a really great result there as well. So at its best, images like this, we can see that it delivers super high contrast, detailed results, even at f1.4, and then a beautifully soft, defocused background. Here at a little bit closer focus distance, but also closer to the background, detail and contrast is looking very good. And we can see that even though the background is close here, there's not really too many hard edges. It's handled quite well. This shot looks beautiful, I think, and it shows the beautiful foreground bokeh you can achieve as well to really isolate a subject. And you can see even at this distance, the depth of field is so tiny that this is in focus, but this is already going out of focus. And that kind of subject isolation is really special. This was maybe my least favorite as far as the busyness. Now, I loved the amount of sharpness and contrast there. This particular background, it just feels like it's a little bit busy, but it's a difficult scene as well. But I would say this is about as bad as what I can show you from the lens. Generally, however, when it came to portrait work, it's a great lens. And so you'll see that the amount of detail and contrast for subject, all of that is great. But then, of course, the ability to have this defocused background is really special. Colors look good, all of that. Here, this shot, and this one I have given it just a little bit of a process look to kind of suit the scene. But you can see shooting through these various layers that focus is really good. Everything that's defocused in the foreground looks good. And then if we zoom into our subject here, you can see great detail and contrast. Everything looks great there. Here again, and this is probably my favorite thing about 135mm lenses generally, and particularly this one with such amazing subject isolation, is to be able to shoot from quite a distance. In this case, I was a good pretty close to somewhere between 13 to 15 meters away, so 40 to 45 feet away from the camera. And yet look at how crisp the cutout is of the subject from the background. Detail all looks good, but then that background still looks so completely blurred out. Moving just a little bit closer here, about 3 or 4 meters closer to the camera, you can see big round specular highlights, even though I'm still about 25 feet or so away from the camera. Great detail and contrast. All of that looks really good. Then on a few other practical concerns, flare resistance is surprisingly strong. I mean, there's a tiny bit of ghosting here, but if I didn't point it out, you might not see it. And then with the lens stopped down here to f11, you can see just that one little ghosting blob, not bad at all. In this case, we've got really, really bright sun reflecting off of the river here, and you can see contrast is holding up, no problems with that. In this shot, we can see the sun is right up here, right out of frame. There's nothing that's coming down into the frame to mar the image. Contrast is holding up well. Really good results. This shot there's a little bit of a glow that entered in with the sun, and maybe you can see a little bit of a halo effect, but I find that to be very artistic and certainly nothing destructive to the image itself. Detail and contrast holding up really good. So flare resistance, I think, is impressive for such a big maximum aperture. Then finally taking a look at this Astro work, and so we can see now obviously you need to use relatively short shutter speeds with a longer focal length like this. Otherwise, you'll start to see stretching of the stars really, really quickly. But we can see here that in the mid frame, there's no chromatic aberrations that ruin the look of star points. And we can see if we pan off towards the edges, there's a tiny bit of stretching here, but as far as coma, it's really, really low. This is a great result, particularly considering that low vignette means that you're not going to end up with noisy corners as you try to brighten them up because of the vignette occurring. So being able to shoot at f1.4 at such a long focal length for this could be a really interesting application. Overall, optically, this is a really solid lens.
So as always, thanks for watching today. I hope that this deep dive into the optical performance has helped you to be more informed as to whether or not this is the lens you've been looking for. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.